So today we're going to be talking about some great books to start if you're trying to get into fantasy. I've made a fantasy for beginners video before, but it was a long time ago, so I'm gonna do it again. Plus, I've read a lot more fantasy since then, so yeah, let's talk about fantasy. But first, a shout out to today's sponsor, Skillshare. Make 2020 a year where you explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity with Skillshare's online classes. Skillshare is an online learning community that offers membership with meaning. With so much to explore, real projects to create, and the support of fellow creatives, Skillshare empowers you to accomplish real growth. Skillshare offers classes designed for real life, so you can move your creative journey forward without putting life on hold. You can learn and grow with short classes that fit your busy routine. Some classes that I find really interesting are real productivity, how to build habits that last, and Instagram photography, shoot, edit, and share with Brandon Wolfel. Skillshare is also incredibly affordable, and an annual subscription is less than $10 a month. Click the link in the description to get 2 free months of premium membership and explore your creativity. I obviously read a lot of fantasy on my channel, and a lot of my subscribers love fantasy, but I also still get a lot of people that are just beginning, so I figured let's talk about some books that will be an easy transition. My first book on this list is going to be The Aeronaut's Windlass. I'm fairly new to Jim Butcher. I know he wrote the Dresden Files, which is a series that I plan on getting to soon, but this is actually the only book that I've read by him so far, and it was really great and also so easy to read. At least in this book, Jim Butcher has such a digestible writing style. He writes things very simply and yet with enough depth to keep you really wanting to read more. This book is sort of like candy in that you can read it so fast and you can read a whole lot of it at once, and yet it still has so much meat to it. Meat candy sounds terrible. It even has some sort of devices in it that I don't tend to like for instance, intelligent talking animals. But the way he executed it was so good that I enjoyed a trope that I tend to not go for. The characters are really compelling, the magic is interesting, the world building is really well done, but the plot, the story itself is so fast-paced, and the writing is simple yet intricate enough that it's so easy to read and yet incredibly satisfying. If you haven't read much fantasy, it's definitely a thicker one, but I think it's also really easy to consume a lot of it at once. If you're new to fantasy, this is a great place to start. My next recommendation is an author, not specifically a book, and we're gonna be talking about Neil Gaiman. So I've read several of his books. I haven't read all of his books, but I've read at least 4? Yeah, for sure 4. And just in general, Neil Gaiman likes to work in where it's the real world, it's our world, and it deals with a lot of real life situations. We're in this world, but there's just also magic in it too, behind the layers. And we follow characters that are peeling back those layers usually. Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite writers because he has this ability to write things in a way that is simple and yet it packs such a hard punch. He can word things in a way that just cuts through me. He also is a really intricate writer where what he establishes in the beginning is very important in the end. I love authors that leave pieces throughout the story, and by the end you realize that every word really was thought out and mattered. And his books do that, and that's a large part of why I love them so much, because of how beautiful his writing is and because of how intricate his stories and thought out his stories are. I end up loving them almost every time. Next book is City of Brass, and not only is this a good intro into fantasy, but it's also a good intro into adult. So if you tend to read young adult books and you're interested in trying out more adult books, City of Brass is technically an adult book, but it's one of those books where a lot of people call it YA because it does feel very YA for a lot of it. If I'm not mistaken, this book takes place in Egypt, and it's completely surrounded in Middle Eastern mythology, which made it a really fun setting. The main character is a young girl who is a thief, and she gets into a situation where she starts dealing with jinnies, I think is how the proper way to say it, and the jinn and their entire world and mythology. It was such a cool world and such a cool concept. The execution was a little bit disappointing for me, and I think in part just because I've read so much fantasy, and so I wanted this book to deliver a little bit more that is unique to it and a little bit less that I've read several times before. But don't let that dissuade you if you're a new fantasy reader, because there's so much that happens in this book that would feel so fresh if this weren't a genre that you were as used to as I am. And just the mythology and the lore around it is enough to make me want to keep reading and just hope that, you know, the next books get even more creative and unique. Next book I'm going to talk about is The Name of the Wind, and I've called this book a good book for beginners several times, and people argue with me about it a lot. So I know that not everybody agrees that this is a good book for beginners, and I'm gonna keep saying what I think. It's not because the story is simple at all, because it's not, but it's just because the story is so digestible. Patrick Rothfuss's writing style is very easy to read, and it's easy to let it consume you and read in large chunks, and yet it's so beautiful that it's easy to be swept away by the beauty of it as well as the simplicity of it. Rothfuss is a phenomenal writer. He does such a good job of making his writing easy to read and yet beautiful and unique. The story itself is also at the same time both simple and very complex. The story feels very simple as you're reading it, but as you get deeper into it, again, you realize how much planning was put into it. I remember finishing The Name of the Wind and just feeling like thought was put into every sentence and every word mattered. And I love that as a reader. It's a book that I started out feeling like, wow, this is really easy to read. I'll finish this in a week. It's fun. And ended with, holy cow, I did those things and it was fun, but also so much thought was put into this world, magic, and characters. I did end up not loving book 2 as much as book 1, so disclaimer there, but again, readers are individuals. Tons of people loved book 2. But I do think that this is a great introduction into fantasy, not because it's simple and not complex, just like every other book on this series. In this video, I'm telling you about books that I love, not books that I think are not good, but just because it's so digestible and yet it really shows you how incredible worlds can be. Next, we'll talk about Duel of Fire, which I'm pretty sure my niece still has. I lent it to her and I don't see it on my bookshelves. Duel of Fire is a young adult series, and it is primarily dealing in fire magic. It's set in a world where there are a few people that have the ability to wield fire, and then there's the cold fingers. I'm pretty sure they're called everybody else. The fire wielders are being sort of oppressed and overused by the kingdom, and there is an uprising, and I don't want to say too much. The books are really short, but they're so much fun to read. It does a great job of really dipping your toe into magic, and really interesting magic, and specifically elemental magic. And it also has a story that comes off really typical, especially for the way YA fantasy usually works. It comes off really typical, but it ends up going in a direction that's so unique for this series, and I love it. Of course, I have to put the Harry Potter series on this list, otherwise all my comments will be, where's Harry Potter? Harry Potter is a great place to start. You guys already know what it's about. Once again, it is a real life world, yet removed from real life, and we're exploring the wizarding world. Fun plots, interesting magic. It's a good time had by all. Next, I'll talk about Foundry Side. This is a recent read for me, and if I'm not mistaken, I think this is also a Middle Eastern setting. It's about a girl who is a thief. She has these magical abilities where if she touches an object, she can read what the object's structure and layout is. So for instance, if she touches the floor, she gets the floor plan of the building. If she touches a wheel, she knows where it's been and where it's going. This doesn't set her up for great social situations because she can't touch people without her senses being overwrought, but it makes her a great thief. There's also magic in this world called scribing, where you can essentially write a very rare language into an object and then force that object to act differently from itself. A wheel can be scribed to believe that gravity is constantly pulling it, it's constantly going downhill so that it will move on its own, and then once it gets to the location that's scribed into it, the scribings will turn off and it will stop. Really, really, really interesting magic system. The way this author writes it, he almost over explains it. He reminds you of the rules of the magic frequently. So if you're new to complex and unique magic systems, this is a great book to start with because he won't leave you trying to figure it out. He'll really tell you about it. Probably the only problem I had with this book was the writing. The author definitely holds your hand, over explains. His descriptions are very on the nose, not a lot of nuance, which isn't my favorite, but if you're new to fantasy, it's perfect for understanding the world and the magic. This will give you a great taste for how interesting magic systems can be, but it'll do it in a way that's super easy to track with and wrap your mind around. There's also an inanimate object that's sentient and has a lot of attitude, which is just one of my favorite sci-fi and fantasy tropes. And last, it wouldn't be a video like this if I didn't talk about Mistborn. Mistborn is the series that made me fall in love with fantasy. If you have hung out with me for any time at all, you know when I started this channel, I very adamantly did not like fantasy. I was convinced that it's a genre that I did not want to read, have tried, and didn't like. And then my brother practically forced me to read Mistborn. And I finally read it because he wouldn't leave me alone. And it was the book that made me realize how incredible this genre could be and how much I truly love it, and I started seeking out other fantasy series, and now it's the genre that I read the most. It took me a minute to get into this book, so I don't know that I would recommend it as your very first attempt at fantasy, though it was mine and it won me over, so it's not like that can't work. But it did, as a newbie fantasy reader, it did take me a while to really care about anything that was happening because Sanderson loves his slow beginnings and his big worlds and big magic systems. But he also does a really good job of explaining things very clearly to you. He has a glossary so that you can look back and see how all the magic works in the world. And this magic system in Mistborn is so cool. Sanderson's another author that clearly plans everything before he even writes his first word. This is another series where by the time I got to the end, I was shocked at how important little details were in the very beginning. He really weaves together the details, and I love it. The characters were really easy to latch on to relate to. They were a ton of fun to follow. The plot was also a lot of fun, but the magic, man, the magic was so cool and so much fun to learn about and experience. This was the book that I latched on to the characters and I latched on to the plot, and it was the book that made me realize a really cool magic system is something I love to see. So there you go. Those are some fantasy books that I think are great for beginners, great for people that are just starting out with this genre and want to dip their toes in and see how they like it. I did not focus on books that I think aren't as good. Some of my favorites are in this list. What I focused on primarily is authors that do a good job of writing things very plainly and explaining things very clearly. There are a ton of fantasy series that I love, but the author does in no way hold your hand, so it would be a tough way to start out. These are awesome books too, but what we talked about today are books that I think are easy to track with if you're not used to tracking with fantasy, that still have awesome stories. If you're new to fantasy and you want to try some of these, I'd love to hear which ones you want to pick up. If you're not new to fantasy and you have some other recommendations of books that you think would be great to start with, please chat with me more about it in the comments. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I'll see you guys again soon.